Right, so welcome everybody. This is the second week of the semester, so this is the week where we'll start working in the labs as well. So today I will go through the first lab sheet that you'll need to deal with, which is VMware Workstation. So if we look on Moodle, there are various documents available there. I will go through everything and explain what everything is. So the first PDF is the VMware file 01, it's the lab sheet itself. We then have a couple of scripts. One is called VM subnet 2, the other one is called fix vmnet dev. And then we have a PDF file, which is the 2.NET subnets, which is the map of the network ranges that we will be using in the lab. And then finally, we have a folder that has some routing utilities inside it. And this is used for the last additional part of the lab sheet itself. So let's make a start with the lab sheet. First of all, you have lab sessions with me either today in the afternoon or on Thursday. All right. Make sure you come to the one that you're allocated in, because if you don't, then attendance will not work. If you need to change group, there is about 30 of you in each of the classes, and the class fits 48, so we can comfortably move students around if we wish to. All right. So if you do want to change a group, change class, send me an email when this is finished, so that I know about it, and come to the class that you want to be in. Okay, so if you are timetable to be in on a Monday, but really you want to be on a Thursday, then just send me an email today and just come in on Thursday in one of the sessions. All right, hopefully not more than 20 people will want to move around in a single class, so we should be able to accommodate this change. Now, the lab sheets, the first one, we're talking about VMware. So VMware is a virtualization hypervisor. So it's a software that we use in order to build ourselves some virtual machines. VMware is one of the oldest companies in the game to be doing this. It's now a very big company. They have their own certifications and everything else. VMware Workstation Player is the simplest form in which their software comes. It's just a software that you can install on your computer, whether it's a Windows, Linux, or Mac, or whatever it is, and you can use it there. You can start some virtual machines in there. You can do some networking and so on. So on this lab sheet, we'll install VMware on our computers in the lab, and we'll see exactly what the program can actually do. Now, because this is the first time that you'll be in the lab, the first day that you'll be in the lab, we need to prepare the computer that you will be working on. So you will not actually be working on the computer itself. Ironically, we will be using the VMware that's already installed on your computers in the lab, and you'll be using a virtual machine in there that's called Prometheus. The name is Greek because I'm Greek, and it's the guy that gave the fire to the people from the gods, blah, 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 blah. Yeah. Anyway, so this virtual machine already exists. I built it for you, and is located in a folder in your home directory called Global. So when you go into the lab, you need to go into the Global folder, you need to find the zip file, open it, and extract it to your home folder. It is in a folder called VMware, so once everything is extracted from the zip file, you'll have a VMware folder. Inside it, there will be a TB2 Prometheus folder, and inside there, the files of the virtual machine will exist. When a virtual machine is built in VMware Player, or really in any other virtualization hypervisor, you have the virtual machine that runs inside the software, but that actually consists of a bunch of files that basically control everything that has to do with the virtual machine itself. There are files from the hard drive space. There's a file which is the main configuration file that has all of the settings of the virtual machine, and so on and so forth. So the process to install this is basically you need to go into the folder, find the virtual machine, extract it from the zip file, and once it's extracted, you basically start up VMware Player. You do file open, so you open the virtual machine, and then that loads your new Prometheus VM. Once that's done, then your virtual machine will be running inside your computer, and that will need you to full screen that virtual machine. So from that point on, you don't really need to do anything else outside the Prometheus VM that you're working on. Okay, there are no files to copy, there's nothing else. Prometheus itself has Google Chrome installed. It's configured so that it can run while you're logged in as root, because this is what I want you to log in, hence the big bright red letters on the lab sheet. All right. Because everything that we do in the labs will pretty much require administrative privileges. So instead of you typing SU root all the time, it's simpler to just log in as root and be done with it. Okay. So you log in as root, you start up your browser, you go on to Moodle, you get the lab sheet and all of the other material that you need. You need to go onto your Google Drive and create a document that will be your logbook for this unit. Okay, and then with that all running, you can go about the lab itself. One last detail that you will need is the networking for this virtual machine. This virtual machine, the Prometheus virtual machine, is set up to be working in bridged mode. This means that the IP address of the virtual machine is on the same subnet as the actual host itself. So in our lab, in NetLab, everything is running on network 148.197.28.0. All right. So all of the actual physical computers in the lab have a 28.something IP address. The .something part of the IP address is located on a little sticker on the bottom left corner of your monitor, and it says VLAN something. So it might say VLAN 65, 70, whatever it is. You need to know what that sticker means. It's basically the last part of your IP address of your physical host. And you'll need this because once you start up the Prometheus virtual machine, you will need to go into its networking settings and change the IP address of the virtual machine itself. The IP address that you will use must be whatever is on your host plus 100. So if you're working on computer Hawthorne, which is 148.197.28.65, then Hawthorne's Prometheus IP address needs to be 165. This is very important, and it's the first important bit that you get correct while you're working in the labs. And I will go around, either I or one of my assistants in the lab, and check that you do in fact have the correct IP address in there. There are lots of wonderful ways that this simple task can go wrong. I've had students in the past assigning an IP address of 28.1 or 28.21, which are our DNS servers, and then the entire lab was without internet. Because all of the computers in the lab were trying to contact that Prometheus VM and get some DNS resolution, which of course didn't work. Okay, so it's very important that you have the correct IP address there, and it's whatever your host has plus 100. Once that's done, you can check it by pinging google.com and see if you get some replies from there. And then once you're at that stage, you can basically go on to Google Chrome, go on to Moodle, start up your lab sheet, go on to Google Drive, create a logbook, and start keeping notes on it and go about the tasks. So in order to get on with the material, we need to install a VMware player itself inside the virtual machine, inside the Prometheus VM. So this is what we call, it's going to be virtual machines inside the virtual machine. So this is what we call nested virtualization. All right. So the first thing you need to do is you need to download the software itself. All you need to do, if you have the browser open inside Prometheus, is basically just click on the link that I have here. That will go on to the VMware's website. It will go on to the Workstation Player website. And on the bottom right page, right-hand side of the page, you will find download VMware Workstation Player 17 for Linux. All right. You will need to download the one that is for Linux, of course, and not for Windows, because Windows files are different than Linux files, and you should know this by now. So they won't work. All right. So once you download that, huge red letters again on the lab sheet. Let's see if this will work this year. Do not double click on the thing that you just downloaded. This is not Windows. It won't work. Yes? So it's a file that has a file extension of .bundle. All right. I know it will show up on the bottom left corner of your browser, and once it's downloaded, you will all be tempted to just click on it. Don't. So what will happen is the text editor will try to open the executable file in the bundle, and that can take roughly about 4 hours. I'm not kidding. I've had students in the past that were waiting for the thing for about 25 minutes and then just raised their hand and said, "Bas, this doesn't work." To which my reply was, "Please read the lab sheet." Okay, so don't click on the bundle. All right. So once it's downloaded, you can go into the downloads folder. You can right-click anywhere on the white blank space in the folder and open a terminal there. And once the terminal is open, you can type ls. So that will show you the contents of the folder. The file will be there, will probably be written in black font. This means that you don't have permissions to run it. You need to change the permissions on it with chmod 777 or A+X or whatever you like to use. And once it's green, so once you type ls and it's green, it means that it's executable, and then it means that you can simply /VMware workstation player, blah, 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 blah. Okay, which is the last command in here. So it is essentially, the bundle is pretty much a script. So to run scripts in Linux, the easiest and quickest way is to / and then the name of the thing. Now once that is installed, you can basically open it and you can create your new virtual machines. We will need to have 4 virtual machines in total in here for VMware, and we'll start first with the first one and then we'll clone it a few times in order to make the rest. So it's a wizard, so you basically just follow it. It says create a new virtual machine. It says use ISO image. So in order to install the operating system, of course, you need to have the source for the operating system installation. That will be an ISO image that is already located in your global folder. I think I might actually have it in the documents as well. So find the ISO image and double click on it so that the virtual machine loads it. The first thing to check is that when you do select the ISO image, then VMware itself should tell you CentOS 7 installation medium detected. This means that VMware Player itself will detect the operating system in there, and in fact what it will do an unattended installation from there on. So you don't need to select the types of packages and everything else that you would normally select in a full installation. It just makes your life a bit easier, and we're just lucky that it actually does the type of installation that I want. It's called a GNOME desktop installation. So it will give you a basic installation of the operating system that has a desktop environment for you to work, and you can basically use it for what we want to use it. One of the most important steps in here is the name of the virtual machine. So you must call it vPrometheus 0, and you must do it at that step. So you must do it early on. And the reason for this is, once you create the virtual machines, the files of the virtual machine itself are actually called vPrometheus 0.something. Because we'll be running a script called vmsubnet2 in the end for the last virtual machine, if you don't rename these files correctly now, the file will be called CentOS space 7 space something. Those spaces will not allow you to run the script that we want to run later on. So that will mean that you'll have to delete all 4 virtual machines at that point and do everything again. So very important, make sure you name the virtual machine straight away as it should be without any spaces inside it. Once you have that, you give it some hard drive space, you give it some memory, and you do everything else that the guide asks for. Once the virtual machine restarts, because it's an unattended installation and it hasn't asked, the name of the virtual machine itself will be wrong. It should be called vprometheus0.netlab.ee.port.ac.uk, because that's the domain that we use in the lab itself. Okay, it's very easy to change. All you need to do is you need to edit the etc. host name file, and then once you do that and restart the virtual machine will have the correct name that you need for the rest of the labs. Now, once you do that, you have one virtual machine that is available for you to play around and see what the software itself can actually do. The instructions on the lab sheet are basically that you play around and look at stuff, click on stuff, and change settings and see basically what everything does. I won't go through this in great detail because there is no point really. Generally in my lab sheets, if I ask you for something, it means that I expect to see an answer in the logbook. Okay, so if it says, the files are named like that, and then I ask why, you need to look this up online and figure out why this is and write it, because it's probably worth a few marks in the logbook itself. All right, So there are a few of these in here. So other than just doing the tasks, getting screenshots of the tasks and everything else, you need to make sure that you answer the questions in here as well. So for example, in the end of this, I want to tell you to change the size of the hard drive of the virtual machine from 20 to 25 gigabytes. In the end, I ask you if the file size in the actual vPrometheus 0 folder itself has changed or not. Surprise, surprise, it hasn't. It doesn't change. Okay, and then I ask you why. All right, so you need to look this up and figure out why, even though you've set the virtual machine settings to use more space, this doesn't actually take up more space on the hard drive itself. Then in the next part, which is I find more important, is we'll play around with the networking. So we'll explore the different modes of networking that VMware can support in an environment like this. So the first virtual machine that you built, you haven't messed around with the network settings at all, so it is in a NATed configuration, so that's network address translation. There is a DHCP server that starts on your Prometheus VM, and it works for the NATed network cards in VMware, and is managed by VMware itself. Your virtual machine starts up, has an automatic IP address allocation, contacts your DHCP server on the host, and gets an IP address from VMware's DHCP server that is running. So this is exactly the setup that you're using at the moment, and that's why your Prometheus 0 virtual machine has internet access. You should be able to go online from virtual machine 0 and do anything that you need to do. What you then need to play around with is you need to figure out the other options available on this. Now, because I don't want you to make changes on the same virtual machine all the time, it's easier to just clone this virtual machine and make 3 more versions of it, 3 more clones of it, and then have one virtual machine for each of the networking types that we want to use. So in order to do this, you need to go into your Prometheus VM. In your /root/VMware folder, you will find the vPrometheus 0 folder. All you need to do is copy and paste the contents of this folder 3 more times next to it. So in the VMware directory, you should end up with 4 folders, and you should rename them what they should be. Another important thing piece of detail to look out for this is that when you're actually copying the files, you need to wait for the files to be copied. There is a very tiny little icon on the file manager in GNOME that we're using. It's a little pie chart on the top right corner. So once you start copying all the files, that pie chart will start filling up. You need to wait for it to fill up completely, which means that the copy has been completed. It should take a bit more than a minute to make all of 3 copies of the virtual machine itself. All right, wait for it to be finished, rename the folders from vPrometheus 0 to 1, 2, and 3, and once that's done, you can basically go into VMware Player itself, and you can start opening the virtual machines one by one and making the changes that you need. The changes that you need to make are, first of all, in the settings of the virtual machines, you need to change the network card connection type. So by default, it should be at NAT. So virtual machine 1 needs to be set up as a bridge, virtual machine 2 needs to be set up as host only, and virtual machine 3 needs to be set up as custom. And then once you do that, you power up the virtual machines, and you go inside them, you go to the terminal, and you gedit the etc. host name file, so you rename them in there to virtual machines 1, 2, and 3 respectively. Once that's done, you're ready to play around with the networking settings. The first virtual machine that we've cloned is the VP1, and it's bridged. This means that it will need to be in the same network neighborhood, same subnet, as the host and as Prometheus. This causes a small problem in the lab, tiny problem, in the fact that we need to allocate IP addresses and make sure that we don't have any conflicts of IP addresses. So at the moment you have 50 computers in the lab, 48, okay, 52, fine, plus the 4 of mine. You have a subnet that is a class C subnet that takes 254 addresses to use, all right. And out of this, we need to make sure that you use 2 bridged networks and don't conflict with each other. So for Prometheus itself, the +100 rule works fine because the IP addresses that we have on the computers physically, +100 don't clash with anything. The problem is building a second bridge on top of that in the same subnet, which means that we've already used the 100 addresses and we now need to use another 50 addresses, so we need to find those 50 addresses. For most of the computers in the lab, the new rule in here, which is your IP address on Prometheus +50 this time, will work fine. You won't have a problem. All right. There are some of the computers, however, that this causes a conflict. All right. So when we get to that part, when you get to building virtual machine 1, you need to make sure that you ask me, not the teaching assistants. Yeah? Ask me to check if your IP address that you want to use is actually free to use. All right. So as an example of this, so my computer in the lab has an IP address of 11. So my Prometheus has 111. So my virtual machine 1 inside Prometheus has 161. All right. That barely gets away with clashing with 165, which will be Prometheus's IP address on Hawthorne, which has an address of 65. All right. So if you have an IP address that's higher than that, then there will be a problem. All right. Just make sure when you use the bridge for VP1 that you ask me first which IP address you should be using and if it's okay to use the +50 rule as we have it in the labs. All right. So once you set up that virtual machine, then because it's bridged and because you have access to the network itself, then you will be able to have full internet access on this and it should just work. You do your pings and get some documentation and you're done with virtual machine 1. We then move on to the second virtual machine 1, which will be set up as host only. Once you make all the changes in the network card and everything else, then that should get an IP address allocated automatically by VMware itself, because it's running another DHCP server for the host only network itself as well. So that will give an IP address for that virtual machine. There are a few questions in this here. So what does the host only mode mean? And what has changed inside the IP address of the virtual machine. So basically, once you change the network card from NAT to host only for this virtual machine, then once it starts, it will get an IP address. It will be different to the NATed IP address that it had, and there will be no internet. All right, so you won't be able to ping anywhere outside that while you're working on a host only mode. I need you to explore this a bit further, see what you can actually ping and what actually happens with it and what host only actually means itself. Generally, I will tell you, host only creates an isolated networking environment for VMware, so you can have virtual machines that have no access to the outside world, that have no contact to the outside world, so you can create a more isolated, secure environment if you want to, in order to have a virtual network in there and play around with it. You can have multiple virtual machines in a host-only configuration, and because of the way that it's set up, they will all be able to ping each other, but they will not be able to ping the outside world. All right. So once the host-only is done, we then go to the fun one, which is the last one, which is the custom networking. So other than those three modes of networking, we can mess around with VMware's capabilities a little bit, and we can pretty much do whatever we like. All right. So instead of just NATing, host only and bridge, we can have a custom networking mode that we basically use in order to customize our network requirements as much as we like. It does behave a little bit like a host only network, but it's not really isolated from the rest of the world at the end of the day. So in order to do this, the virtual machine itself, in its settings, will need to have one more option for the network card. So it will need to have a custom option for the network card. In order to do that, we'll need to run a couple of scripts. The first script that we'll need to run is the VM subnet2 script, and that looks like this. Now this script has various things happening for it. So it customizes the way that the VMnet virtual network cards of VMware actually start and run in the system, and what it actually creates and allows to run. You don't need to mess around with it. Read through it if you like. It's quite well annotated. And what you care about is the part with the IP addresses for VMnet2. Essentially, this script will start and configure a network card that's called VMnet2. It will give it an IP address and a subnet mask, a default gateway, and basically we can do whatever we want with it. Other than that script, we also have another script that's called fix VMnet dev, and you don't actually need to change anything in here. You don't need to actually do anything to this. You just need to use it as a tool so that you give your virtual machine the ability to have custom network cards. So this is this part down here. So basically what you need to do with the fix VMnet dev script is you need to save it inside the vPrometheus 3 folder on the Prometheus virtual machine. So not inside the new virtual machine that you created, but inside your virtualization host where all of your virtual machines actually live. This is because this is a script that will change the settings of the executable file of vPrometheus 3 that we're using. All right. Now, this means this is the file that needs to have no spaces in the file names that I was talking about when we were naming the virtual machines. All right. So once you place this script in its correct location, which will be in /root/VMware/vPrometheus3, you need to run it. For it to work, the virtual machine needs to be powered off completely. Okay, so vPrometheus 3 needs to be shut down completely, not running and not even suspended. Once you run the script, a couple of things will happen. When you load up vPrometheus 3 again, and you go into the settings of the virtual machine, instead of one NATed network card or whatever, it will have 3 network cards. Those 3 network cards are created from the script itself. You don't need to have all 3 of them. You only need to have one of those network cards. So you can delete, you can remove the second and third network cards. The remaining network card now will have a new option appear to it, and that new option will be custom networking. So that virtual machine will not only be able to do NAT bridge host only, it will be able to do NAT bridge host only and custom. Now out of that custom option, it will have a drop-down menu next to it, and you will be able to select which network card, which of the available VMnet interfaces you want to use. In order to be able to select VMnet2, which is the network card that we want to use, that network card needs to be running. And for that network card to be running, our other script, the VM subnet2 script, needs to be running as well. For that script to be running, we need to have it configured correctly with the correct IP address for our computer. So this is where the fun begins. How do we allocate IP addresses to that custom networking for the computers in the lab, and while making sure that you don't all use 192.168.0.1. Right. So what we have is we have different subnets available to use inside NetLab. So as I said, all of the computers in the lab live on subnet 28. So all of the computers have an address of 148.197.28 something for the physical hosts, the Prometheus Bridge VM, and the VP1 Bridge VM as well. Now we have other networks available in that lab. We have subnets 30, 31, and 32 that are available to use. We won't need 31 and 32 for this. We can only work on subnet 30 as it is. And we've basically taken the entire class C subnet, starting from 30.0 ending to 30.255, and we split it into 64 slices. The reason why we've done this is because we have 48 computers in the lab, starting from Farina and going all the way down to Hakkinen. Okay, and they are 48 computers plus a few spare network lines plus the one that I use for my computer, which is Sure. All right, so that's why we have 64 slices. We have 64 slices of the network because our available options have to be multitudes of 2. It has to be something that's the power of 2. So if it wasn't 64, it would be 128, or it would be 32, or 16, or 8, and so on. And since we have 48 hosts, and we need to have enough networks available, we use 64 addresses, 64 networks. Now, out of all of this means that you need to figure out which computer you're sitting on. Again, a little sticker in the middle on the bottom of your monitor will give you your computer name. You need to find your computer name on this list, and then you need to decide on the IP addresses to use for your custom virtual machine. You will need to use 2 IP addresses out of all of this. The first address, you will need to allocate it inside this script. So the first address will be the address that you use here. And the second address will be the address that you will use inside the settings of the virtual machine itself. Now, in order to do this, we need to have all of the information that we can get out of this. We have a network address for all of the computers, we have a broadcast address for all of the computers, and we have usable IP addresses that we can actually use on network cards for our network. The usable IP addresses are only 2 anyway per computer because of the way that we've subnetted this. All right. So if, for example, I was working on Hunt, then the first IP address that I would use would be 30.45, and the second IP address that I would use would be 30.46. This means that if I go back to my script, the VMnet IP here for Hunt would be 30.45. All right. This example file is actually created for my computer. It's created for Shumi. All right. And that's why I'm using 253. So if we go into the last line of this file, we'll see that my network address is 252. My broadcast address is 255 because I'm sitting at the end of the network. And the usable IP addresses for me are 253 and 254. So network, broadcast, IP addresses. If we go back into the file, it's asking for network, which for me is 252. It's asking for broadcast, which for me is 255. And it's asking for an IP address, which for me the first usable IP address is 253. All right. This means that I've covered all of my IP addresses and all of the networking information that I need to use for this script to run. The only thing that's left now is the subnet mask. And the subnet mask for me and for all of you in the class as well is going to be 255, 255, 255, 252. The reason for this could be a lecture in and on itself. I will try to simplify this as much as possible. A normal class C network subnet mask would be 255.255.255.0. Okay. Now, because I've taken a class C network and I've split it into 64 slices, it means that I've altered the number of available computers, available hosts, available IP addresses for each of my subnets. All right. Now, in order to do this, I've taken the subnet mask, which we can see here in decimal form, and then we can see it in binary form. And I've stolen some of the host bits in it and made them network bits. So as it is here, the first 3 octets are basically the network, and the last 3 would basically be the number of hosts. Okay, so that would be binary to decimal conversion, 8 bits, because we have 8 digits on this, 2 to the 8th, which gives us 256. So starting from 0, ending up to 255, that's the 256 different combinations of binary digits that we can have in an 8-bit address. All right. Now, because we split this into smaller slices, and we end up with 64 different networks, those 64 different networks can only fit 4 numbers in them. Right? Because 4 times 64 is 256. So those 4 numbers can be represented by only 2 bits. So you have 00, 01, 10, 11. All right, so those are the 4 different numbers that each of our hosts can basically count on. And out of these 4 numbers, unfortunately, we have to take away one for network address and one for a broadcast address. So we end up with 1, 2, 3, 4. Network address, broadcast address, and 2 usable IP addresses in the middle. Because we've done this, then this means that our subnet mask has changed, and now it has 6 ones here instead of 6 zeros. And if we convert this into decimal, that will give us 252, which is the subnet mask that we're using. Okay, because the first bit is 1, and then +2, +4, +6, +8, +16, +32. All right. So this is why the subnet mask for our custom network, for anything that has to do with the addresses on subnet 30 that we will be using on our 30 custom virtual machines, will be 252 in the end. And that's why on this script, our subnet mask ends up being 252. So this completes all of the information that you need in order to fill in the IP addresses in the script. The first one is your minimum IP address. The second one will be the same for all of you, and it will be 252. The third one will be your network address, straight out of the subnet file. And the fourth one will be your broadcast address, again, straight out of the subnet files itself. Now, once you have this script completed, then you can run it, /vmsubnet2. When you run this, all of your virtual machines must be either off or suspended. So basically, they must not be running on the screen. Okay. And once you run it, the differences that will happen on your Prometheus networking, if you type ifconfig in a terminal, you'll see a new network card called VMnet2 has now shown up, and it hopefully has the IP address that you wanted to have. All right. And if you look at the processes that are running on the system, the VMnet processes that are running on the system, you'll have a new process in there called dev VMnet2, and that's the network card that's actually running on the system. With that in place, you can then go on to the virtual machine itself, vPrometheus 3. You go to the settings, and you can select the VMnet2 network card now, because now it is available from the drop-down menu. And then you start up the virtual machine, go into the network card settings, and give it the correct networking information. So inside those network card settings, you need to use as an IP address your second usable IP address from the subnet file. The subnet mask will be 252. The gateway will be the first usable IP address. So whatever you used for VMnet2, because the VMnet2 network card on Prometheus will be the gateway for that virtual machine. And then you need to give it a DNS server. That's it. Once you do that, you should be able to ping your default gateway. You should be able to ping your Prometheus virtual machine from your vPrometheus 3. So the difference between VP3 and VP2 is that you can actually ping other IP addresses on Prometheus itself. You're not limited in any way because it's not a host-only network. It's a custom network that you created, and it has that added benefit. Which leads us to the last task of the lab sheet. Because you're not limited inside the host-only network and you can ping your host, you should really be able to ping beyond your host as well if you set up routing on your host. Routing in Linux is done with Zebra or Quagga, whatever we call it nowadays. And you can implement a routing protocol like OSPF, for example. And then once you do that, and if it's working correctly, you should have full internet access on vPrometheus 3, past your Prometheus VM, past your host, and past the rest of the lab. In order to do this last part, which we will help you, but not very much, if you go into the routing utils folder in here, I have the routing lab sheet as a reference, so that you can see basically where all the files should be and how everything should run, the commands for everything to run. And we're also giving you example files for zebra.conf and ospfd.conf, the configuration files that need to be changed for this. All right. So we'll generally let you play around with this and try to figure it out yourselves. If you have configured the files and everything else and still doesn't work and you call us, we will come and help you with it. If you haven't done anything on it and the files are not in place and configured, we will not help you with it. Okay. So this is it. Very simple, very straightforward. Okay, so once you are in the lab, things will make sense because you'll be able to see everything. All right. And also, let me see if I have that in place already. There is a video in next week's slide, basically. Okay, so that should take you to, let's check that I've done it correctly. Yes. It's a lovely video, it only lasts 1 hour and 11 minutes. So I basically do the lab sheet here. Okay, please don't watch it until you've had a try at everything yourselves first. Okay, and then if you're stuck with it, this lab sheet is supposed to run for 2 weeks. Have a genuine go at it yourselves without this on the first week, and then in the second week, or between the second week and the first week, have a watch at this if you like, see how I set everything up. Things will seem familiar in this because you've already tried it in the lab once anyway. Okay, I have to warn you, there are differences because this was done during lockdown and I was working at home. So there are private IP addresses on the outside of Prometheus itself. Okay, but generally, where to configure everything exists and is shown clearly in this video. So if you have a go at it and you get stuck, you can also watch the video as well and get some help and figure out what you need to change. But if you are in the lab while you're trying all this out, there will be plenty of us there to help you. So if you get stuck somewhere, just basically ask us and we'll help you with it. Okay. Any questions about all this? I will do a quick recap. The idea is, it's the first lab sheet, so you need to prepare your Prometheus virtual machine in which you will be doing all of your work. Inside there, you will now install VMware Player so that you see how it installs. You'll go around and play around with the settings of VMware Player itself, see what sort of information you can change, and so on. You'll then build 4 virtual machines, one for each of the different types of networking that VMware supports. You'll power them up, you'll try to connect to the internet with them, see what works and what doesn't. NAT and Bridge should have internet access straight away on their own. The host-only virtual machine should never have internet access. And finally, the custom virtual machine that you will customize by running a script to change the settings of it to support a custom network card and run another script to configure that custom network card called VMnet2. It will run and you should be able to have access all the way up to Prometheus. And if you do the last task, you should have full internet access because you set up routing on Prometheus on it. All right. So that's what you need to do. You have 2 weeks to do this. Okay. And if you need any help, basically just let us know. Thank you very much.